Apparently I'm muted. All right, welcome. I just told you a really, really good joke, and I only was the one that was laughing at it. Just kidding. So we're waiting for a few people to jump on. But does anyone have any questions that they want to bring up before we start into what I have today? We good? Okay. Okay, so quick question before we get started. In the REPC, what is addressed in section 7? Section 7. Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Let's take a guess.
I don't
Somebody
know
guess.
with that. 8, isn't 8 about additional earnest money and different things like that? I'm trying to remember, just kind of going through it in my mind.
8 is buyer's condition.
7, seller's disclosures.
There we go. Winner. Kaylin wins. Okay, seller's disclosures. So this is an important one, especially if we represent the buyer or the seller. But mainly if we're representing the buyer or the seller, we have a responsibility. And we also have a responsibility as buyer as well. So we want to make sure that we are understanding this. So we're going to go through a couple things with the seller's disclosures, and hopefully clear up some confusion that I've seen, and also some questions about it. So let me pull up. First thing we're going to pull up is let's see here, right there. Okay, you should see the REPC in section 7. So we can see that this is a seller's disclosures. We want to look at this and say no later than the seller's disclosure deadline, section 24A, seller shall provide to the buyer the following documents in hard copy or electronic format, which are collectively referred to as seller's disclosures. Okay, so section 24A refers to the seller's disclosures deadline. That means everything in this section needs to be given to the buyer by that date. Okay, so it doesn't mean that we get a couple of the things and when we miss them, we want to get everything there. So if for some reason, let's say that you took a listing and you're in an HOA, and you haven't got the minutes, you haven't got everything, you haven't even ordered title, you haven't done any of that stuff yet, and you get an offer that comes in that says they want to have seller's disclosures within 2 days. Just keep in mind that if you don't provide this, this puts your client in a predicament where they will be in default of the contract. Now, if the seller becomes is in default and the buyer cancels and they say, well, what did we do? And it comes down to it that we didn't get this information. Who do you think they're going to be looking at? Who do you think they're going to be blaming for not getting this information? I hope you're pointing at yourself, because as every situation we look at is who's at fault here. And if a seller says that they're in default and you haven't given them, you've asked for this information, or you've asked for it and they didn't get enough time to do it, then we're going to need to make sure we counter that REPC that comes in. So it's easier to do if you look at that and say, okay, I don't have all this information. Try to get that information in your pre-listing while you're getting ready to list the property, get everything going. You can order title commitment and all of that stuff. You can get that before it even hits the market, or just when you get an offer, just make sure you have enough time to get that information to them. So let's look at this real quick and see what we have to get and see if there's any questions on this. So if you have questions, bring it up. But number 1 is a written seller's property condition disclosure completed, signed, and dated by the seller as provided in section 10.3. Okay, so that's our seller's disclosure. We're going to go over some of that before. It used to be a 6-page document. Now it's like 16 pages. But regardless of it, the seller just has to give some kind of a property condition disclosure to the buyer. If the home was built prior to 1978, the lead-based paint disclosure and acknowledgement needs to be there. If your property is prior to 1978, I would get that completely signed and put it on the MLS as an attached document so that they can print it off and they can send it in with their offer. C, a title commitment referenced in section 6.1. So we all know that the seller is providing a title, a marketable title to the property in the form of like a general warranty deed. So they're committing to already doing that by signing this contract. So what this is saying that they've already committed to a title company, they've already started the process, and there's a commitment for the seller to buy that. You will want to go in and update that with the buyer's names so that you can see if there's any judgments on the buyers. That way you can protect your client. D, a copy of the CC&Rs, rules, regulation affecting the property. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's say that your property is not in an HOA. Can your property still have CC&Rs, rules, and regulations, even though it's not in an HOA?
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact,
Okay,
a lot of subdivisions do. And a lot of times we don't get these from the title company. Sometimes I've asked for it, even though, because most of them have them, but some of them, I even had one on like a 1950 whatever subdivision. But most of those types of things, it's like the kind of, how they set up that subdivision. I just always say, most of these things are not a problem unless a neighborhood puts it as a problem, like the trees that they put in. But I'm not exactly positive of what exactly we should tell them with these old CC&Rs.
Yeah, so I mean, most subdivisions that are being created, in order to get a permit from the city's requiring them to have CC&Rs and rules and things that they put in. So some of them are a little more extensive than others. It really comes down to the people in that community enforcing those rules. So you can't really tell your buyer, no, this is not going, like it's part of the CC&Rs, they need to be aware of it, but is it ever being enforced? That has to be coming from the person who created the CC&Rs to be enforced. And so what I see normally is a builder will come in, they'll create their CC&Rs for a community, and once it's all completely sold out, then the builder's gone and gone on to something else, and nobody's really managing those rules and regulations for the community. So you're not going to see them being enforced as much, but just because it's not enforced doesn't mean it's not still rule there. In fact, there's a funny story about that. So I grew up in Murray here in Salt Lake, and they have a rule that's still in the Murray books that says you cannot spit on State Street. And they've never taken it off the books because it was actually put in place a long time ago, and it was mainly for other reasons, but it's still on the books. So Chris, to answer your question with that, is just because it's not on the books doesn't mean somebody couldn't get in trouble for it, but the likelihood, you're just, what our job is as agents is not to tell them you're not going to get in trouble for it or you are going to get in trouble for it, but to provide it for them so they can make their decision based on whether or not they want to buy in that community or not, based on whatever restriction is put in there. So trees are a good example of that. Like if they put the wrong trees in there, is somebody going to come and have them take those trees down? Well, I mean, the reality is somebody possibly could. That makes sense?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so just keep in mind that everything, there are lots of them. You might need to get a CC&Rs that are not with the HOA. Next one, C or E, a copy of recent minutes, budget, financial statements, and homeowner association, if any. So if you're in an HOA community, there's gonna have in order to maintain their HOA in good standings, they have to have meetings in order to do that. And depending on how well managed that HOA, those minutes, that budget, that financials they're gonna go from all over, from one page to really extensive information. So one question I did get a couple weeks ago, and I didn't have the answer to it, but I found out the answer from then, is if the minutes and the budgets and the financial statements are on the homeowners association website, and if you click on their website, it has all of the minutes, do I have to download every one of those documents and send it to the buyer, or could I provide them with a link to get those documents off of the site? So what do you guys think about that? Do I need to download everything and then put it in, give it to the buyer, or could I send them a link to those minutes and they can download them themselves?
That's a good question. I would wonder if you could do that if they acknowledged the receipt of being able to have those. But
I think you would
usually
have
send
to
them
download
all.
them and send them.
Okay, Chris, you're saying, so one of you says that you have to and one doesn't, right? Anybody else?
Well,
wanna
I don't know.
chime in?
I always send them, but I'm wondering if you could, if they acknowledged, if you specified, here's the minutes, here's the blah, 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 here's the link to all of these things. Please acknowledge receipt of these. I don't know. I don't do that. I've always sent them over, but I'm wondering if you could, if you got acknowledgement of receipt.
And that was the question that was coming up, is they just sent a link over, and the argument was, well, they didn't actually send them. And I called the legal hotline on this one, and he pointed out this part right here that says electronic format, which are collectively referred to as the seller disclosures, that as long as it's not multiple, like they have to search for them, you can send a link that will go to it. Let's say that you put it in a Dropbox folder, you put a link where they could actually download them, then you actually will be okay. But what you're saying, Chris, as far as getting confirmation that they have received that's going to protect you in this process. So you don't necessarily have to download them all and send them all the big file. But what the legal department was saying is, as long as when they click on it, then they can come up with those documents and they don't have to go through and search for them. Like there's some HOAs where it comes in and says HOA financials, HOA minutes. And if you click on that website, it's all that information is right there. Well, if that's what you're giving them, that's sufficient for it. But if they don't have that type of a system in place, then you're going to be better off downloading them and sending them over to them. Does that make sense? Okay. F, any long-term tenant lease or rental agreements affecting the property not expiring before closing. So if you've got something in place, you're selling the property, you've got to make sure you have all of those agreements over to them. So if a property management group has been running those, you might need to get in contact with them prior to going under contract, because it might be a little longer process to get those lease agreements from them. Just be aware that sometimes it takes it a little bit to get to them. G, short-term leases or bookings for guests using the property after closing. Okay, so I remember a scenario that came into the organization a year or two ago, that they were using their home and they would rent it out during Christmas to somebody, and they'd have these short-term agreements. Well, they had booked it out for the following Christmas and sold their home in April, but forgot to tell the buyer that they had a short-term rental agreement that was signed and agreed to, so that the family had use of it during the Christmas. So as you could probably imagine, this was not a fun experience for the group that came in during Christmas and was expecting to stay in a house. And for a new buyer who owns a house, and who actually has a lease that happened prior to their agreement. So they really have to honor that agreement. And I'm pretty sure that that ended in a not so pleasant conversation for anybody involved. So if your client is doing any short-term rentals, make sure that if there is any rentals that are after closing, that those are disclosed to the client, the buyer is buying them. H, a copy of the existing property management agreement affecting the property. Okay, so if they do have a property manager, make sure you have those agreements. Evidence of water rights, shares, section 1.4. This is if you're selling any property that has water rights or water shares. Those are separate property that can be sold or not sold with when you sell the house. So you need to make sure that if you are selling them with the house, that all of those proper documents are in order. And the biggest key with this one could take a little bit of time, because an owner who might have owned the home for 30 or 40 years decides they're going to sell the home, and there is water shares there, but they don't know where the water shares and the water right certificates are. They're in some filing cabinet in the basement, and they've never seen them ever, and they just know they exist. This is something that if you're going to sell them with them, you might want to get a hold of the water companies and get a copy of those rights and shares before you go under contract. J, written notice of any claims or condition known to the seller relating to environmental problems or building or zoning code violations. So if your seller put in a basement, didn't put in a permit, and they've flagged them but hadn't done anything about that, you need to make sure that they're giving those notices to the buyer. Some sellers don't want to give some of this information because they feel like it's going to hurt the property. The way that I always look at it is, it's better to kill the deal before it closes than have the deal close and end up in court trying to defend yourself. It's a whole lot cheaper to go find another buyer that's willing to work with the problems you have in your home than is to hide it from the buyer you currently have and end up having to fight that in court. And then letter K, this is the FERPTA one. If your client's a foreign person, this is a good conversation to have with someone that is not a US citizen, because at closing, they're going to hold some money back, and it's not going to be a good conversation when they realize that a good portion of their money is going to be held for these tax purposes. And then is other. So you want to watch this in your contracts when they come up, because if somebody writes something in there and you sign and agree to it, you're saying that no later than the seller's disclosure deadline, whatever is in this section is going to be provided for you. So just make sure that whatever that is, you're able to get it. So it's really on us as agents, as represented from the seller, to make sure that we are getting this information on time and we're not putting our clients in jeopardy of losing that. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to the actual seller's disclosures. We're going to talk just a little bit about that. So here's the question that's been brought up. Should a licensee review the seller's disclosures? Okay, you should see the seller's disclosures. Okay. So should a licensee review the seller's disclosures? I know.
I do.
What's that?
I do. I review them. I don't, because maybe if I've seen something as I've walked through the property, that's obvious and they haven't included it, that might be a problem, then I make sure that I review it. I don't fill them out, but I do review them.
Yes. Okay, that's perfect. Don't ever fill them out, no matter what. In fact, even if you have a client that's older in years and not able to fill them out themselves, have a family member or somebody else other than you as the agent filling these sellers disclosures out. Under really no circumstances that I can think of would I suggest you filling these out for your client, unless you are the client, then I wouldn't fill them out. We had an agent who ended up filling out all of these. This was probably 6 months ago, filled out all of the seller's disclosures for him because the guy was an avid drinker and he was not able to do it himself. And as you can imagine, the problems that could create for somebody if they filled it out. So I just wanted to pull up these first two sections right here. We're going to just read through them real quick because I don't think we really understand this as much, but this is the notice. Notices to buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers are advised that the seller's brokerage and its agents are trained in marketing of real estate. Neither the seller's brokerage nor its agents are trained or licensed to provide buyer or seller with professional advice regarding the physical condition and of any property or regardless of regarding legal or tax matters. The seller's brokerage and its agents strongly recommend that in connection with any offer to acquire the property, buyer retain the professional services of legal and or tax advisors, property inspectors, surveyors, and other professionals to satisfy buyer as to any and all aspects of the physical and legal condition of the property. Okay, so our contracts say that the property is sold as is. So that means that we don't really need to do anything with the property other than this is the property, but it doesn't say that we don't disclose what it is to them. So in order for us to maintain this part right here that says buyer and seller, let's see, neither the seller's brokerage nor its agents are trained or licensed to provide buyer with professional service regarding physical condition. Okay, this sentence right here, if you step out of your bounds and you start giving them professional advice for the condition of their property, you're going to create a problem for yourself. You got to realize that if you are not a professional inspector, then don't pretend to be a professional inspector. If you're not a tax person, CPA, don't pretend to be a tax service CPA. Same with legal. If you're not that, then don't pretend to be, because as soon as you start acting in that manner, then this notice that we're not professional in that area becomes a question. Okay, then it continues here. It says if the buyer's agent brokers are providing this document to an unrepresented seller, the seller acknowledges and agrees that the buyer's agent's brokerage represents solely the interests of the buyer. Okay, this is a question I get brought up a lot. What if I represent a buyer and I'm buying it for sell by owner property? Can I provide them with the seller's disclosures? And the answer is yes, you can provide them with the seller's disclosures. You want to provide them with the seller's disclosures. You're not going to fill them out, as we've talked about, but you want to provide that to the seller so that your buyer is protected. So regardless of whether they have representation or not, you can submit this to them to have that done. The seller acknowledges the buyer's agent brokers have advised the seller is entitled to be represented by the seller, by the real estate agent that will be representing the seller exclusively. The seller has, however, elected not to be represented by the real estate agent in this transaction, and the seller further acknowledges and agrees that all actions of the buyer's agent brokerage, even those to assist the seller in performing or completing any of the seller's contractual or legal obligations, are intended to be for the benefit of the buyer exclusively. So this is the question that comes up with anything to do with, I'm not representing this client. So what, I can't fill out the contract for you. I can't get these disclosures. I can't get all of this stuff for my client. If it pertains to your client and it's a benefit to your client and it needs to be done, then this is a notice to them that you're going to send it to them and they're still representing themselves. So that's something that I get questions quite a bit, where they're waiting for the seller to do certain things, but the seller doesn't necessarily know that they're supposed to disclose. Here's the instructions to your seller. Seller is obligated under law and under Rep C Section 7A, regardless of occupancy, This is a big one right here, regardless of occupancy. To disclose to the buyers defects in the property and the fact known to the seller that are material or adversely affect the use and value of the property that cannot be discovered by a reasonable inspection by an ordinary prudent buyer. This disclosure form is designed to assist seller in complying with these disclosures. So this is just there to provide assistance. This whole document is here to help them fulfill that requirement. But it's not necessarily all inclusive. You might have somebody who sends you something that's not as long or longer, or that's not necessarily this form. What they're trying to do is fulfill their obligation under the REPC, which states that they're going to provide written property disclosures, and they're going to be signed and dated by the seller that's going to fulfill that. So the question comes in, oh, they didn't send this, or they sent it wrong, or it's not completely filled out, and my buyer's got to sign it. Well, all the buyer's doing here is recognizing, I'll skip down to the bottom. If you notice this, all this is right here is acknowledgement of receipt by the buyer. So one thing I tell my buyer clients a lot is, we are signing this to acknowledge that we received it. We're not signing this agreeing that we are happy with it, that we believe that's 100% correct, or that it's filled out 100% the way that my client wants it to be filled out. We're signing that we've received this. Now, let's say that they don't fill out any of this information. The buyer, the sellers just give you a blank form and they send it over to you as a buyer. What are your options as a buyer and that in that situation? Does anybody know? Okay, so some of our options are that we can go back and we can ask the seller specific questions. We can send it back and ask them to fill it out properly. We can look it through here and say, what are things that I'm concerned about? And we can ask them specifically. Now, if they don't ever disclose it, now your buyer has a decision. Do I move forward without knowing, or do I back out of the contract? And that's part of your due diligence term, is to figure out any questions that they have. Now, it's easy for the seller. I wouldn't recommend, if we represent the seller, I wouldn't recommend them not filling this out. In fact, Russ talks about he talks about an attorney that, maybe Russ, you can jump in on this one and just tell us what that attorney said about filling this out.
Yeah, so I had a friend / attorney for the company when I was with Coldwell Banker that sold his house in Farmington, and somehow the buyer told him, here he found out the buyer wasn't going to do a physical inspection or hire an inspector. And so he went through these disclosures and checked yes on anything that potentially he might have, had in there any issues, or I'm making that sound bad maybe, but ultimately, like cracks on the stucco, he checked yes. Like, are there anything he could check yes on? That's probably the best way of saying it. If there was any chance at all he could check a yes, he did. And his reasoning when I asked him about it is, he said, if we end up in court and I've checked yes, the judge is going to turn to the buyer and say, why did you not check that out further when they told you yes on it? So anyway.
Yeah, perfect. So really, this protects your seller by disclosing it, because we're selling the home as is. But if we disclose it and somebody says, hey, you didn't tell us about this, and you come back to the seller's disclosures and the mark is checked yes, and then they're going to look at that and say, yeah, actually it was disclosed. Case dismissed. You're not going to have a problem. So from the seller's perspective, it's really easy to fill out. If there's a white box, then one of those boxes needs to be checked. Yes, no, in this section. So everything should have some kind of a check mark on there. So then the question comes, what if it's an estate sale, or it's somebody's died and the person who's selling it has never lived in the home whatsoever. Well, this is still required to be disclosed, to complete the form. Right here, there is no ownership. I've never lived in the property, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't know anything about the property. And the question that I have is, you'll come in here and say, to your knowledge, does any of the former owners make any additions, structural changes, or alterations to the property? And you're like, well, I don't know, I never lived in the property. Well, then, to your knowledge, you don't know of anything. And I think that's one of the confusions we get with the seller's disclosures is, instead of saying yes and no, we're trying to define it in our own head of what it is. If you know about it, then the answer is yes. If you know nothing about it, then the answer is no, because you don't know anything about it. It's not saying what is the problem, like you can expound on it, but it's just saying, do you know if any of this is happening? And so anybody can fill this out. In fact, I can fill one of these out on Russ's property because I've never been to his property, but I could fill this out to the best of my knowledge and complete it if I was an owner of his property. That is, if I'm not an owner of his property, I'm not filling it out. Okay. Let's see. Last thing I wanted to bring up on this is the very bottom. Actually, no, it wasn't on the very bottom. It's on this here. It said, so it goes back to the first question I asked you, should a licensee review the seller's disclosure? And the answer is yes, to ensure the information the licensee knows about has been disclosed. So we've had this question come up a few times. What happens if I know something as an agent that the client told me, and then I look at the seller's disclosures and I find out that they didn't disclose that on the seller's disclosures? What is my responsibility for that? And here's what
you have to disclose it.
Yeah,
Any material issues with that.
Exactly. And it said, and that's exactly how it comes down. It says, what is a material information? The Supreme Court said, to be material, the information must be important. Important is, in turn, can be gauged by the degree to which the information could be expected to influence the judgment of a person buying the property or assenting to a particular purchase price. So basically it's saying is, if it has any value to determining whether somebody's going to continue buying the property or they're going to it's going to affect the price of the property, then it's our obligation to disclose it. So if you look at it and you see, okay, they didn't disclose this, and we go in and we say, hey, you probably should disclose this, and so one, if they disclose it, they can do an addendum to the seller's disclosures. Okay. Two, if they say, I'm not going to disclose it, at that point, you've got to keep in mind that we have an obligation to, one of our fiduciary duties is to be obedient to our sellers as long as it's not breaking the law. And one of our jobs as an agent is to make sure that if there's something that is materially affecting the property and it cannot be discovered by a prudent buyer and inspection. So let's say that there is a gigantic hole on the wall and they could see it and they forgot to put that on the seller's disclosures. Would we need to go back there and disclose it? Well, anytime we say, should we disclose it? I always will say, yes, go and disclose it. But that's something that's obvious. That's something that's there. You just want to make sure that if it wasn't there, that the sellers put it on their seller's disclosures. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. There was one other thing I wanted to say about seller's disclosures. I forgot. Okay. Any questions about seller's disclosures? Clear as can be. Everybody's feels like we shouldn't have any problem with Section 7.
I had a question, and maybe we've already talked about this, but so when we were talking about like the FERPTA, if you have a buyer that is a foreign person that doesn't have like actual citizenship, but they have like the right to work, they can buy a house like with a normal loan and everything. Is there anything we need to explain to them besides the fact that, you know, they might just have the taxes held back if they sell?
To my knowledge, the tax implications happen when you sell a property, because there isn't any taxes on the front end, but that's my
Yeah.
understanding of it.
Okay, cool.
Just disclosing that to them, you know, that
Yeah,
when that
yeah.
happens, they need to make sure they have, they're aware of it. I mean,
Okay.
it makes sense, and when you tell people about it, it makes sense, but if you're doing that at the closing table, I think we had one last year that they had to hold back like $40,000 that the seller was thinking they were gonna get, and they held them back for the tax, for the FERPTA regulations.
Yeah. Well, I
Obviously,
think they hold back like more. I think they hold back like more than they need to just in case.
yeah, they do. Yeah, they'll hold back, a lot more than they need to, but that's because they want to protect, the title company wants to protect themselves and make sure that nobody has to come up with money if the seller skips town and doesn't pay the taxes, and the
Yeah.
government's going to get their taxes. Which is why, as an agent, make sure you put your taxes off to the side when you make money, because they're still going to come get their taxes. So every paycheck you get, put some money aside so you have money when tax season comes around. That's I think a big challenge for agents. Okay. All right. Well, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you have a great weekend. If there's any other questions, I'll stay on for a second, but otherwise, have a great weekend. Give us a call if you need anything.
Have a great weekend. Happy Thanksgiving
Thank
to
you.
y'all.
Thank you. Oh yeah, no call next week.